just done your Jack the Ripper tour, and fantastic, I've got to say. You know, really, really great job. Fascinating story. You know and tell it very well. Being a former detective myself, I sort of understand, as you've alluded to, about reliability of witnesses and the police officers in particular. Did they go where they said? Did they look where they said? These are dark streets, weren't they? But one witness you didn't mention was Israel-schwartz, the Hungarian Jewish chap that came across Liz Stride, or where there were two cases. Why does your tour not include his?
I think some of the other tours might mention Israel-Schwartz at the time. He was never actually called to an inquest or anything like that. So what happened with him was the murder of Elizabeth Stride took place. Then he'd gone forward to police. They said he was described as Hungarian, Semitic and thespian in appearance. He only spoke Yiddish, I seem to remember. But he'd gone to the police, and then he claimed through a translator that on the night of the murder, he'd been walking along Burn Street at about the right time the murder took place. He said as he was walking down, he said he remembers seeing a man in front of him who was walking as if partially intoxicated. He said whoever this man was, then approached the entrance to Dutfield's yard, and Elizabeth Stride was standing on the corner. And he said that after brief conversation, the man had grabbed hold of her, thrown her to the ground, and she screamed 3 times, but not loudly, or something to that effect. He said he felt timid of getting mixed up in quarrels or something to that effect. Whatever was going on, he didn't want any part of it. So he said he stepped across to the other side of the road, and as he did, there was a man standing there underneath a gas lamp, lighting a pipe. He then claimed that whoever this man was supposedly attacking Elizabeth Stride had turned to the man standing under the pipe, and apparently in reference to Israel-Schwartz had shouted the word Lipski at him, which according to Israel-Schwartz, and Israel-Schwartz alone, was an anti-Semitic insult, he claimed, on account of a murder that had taken place on the next street across, Batty Street, the year before, when a man named Israel Lipski had been convicted of rape, acid attack, murdering a woman called Miriam Angel. He'd been sensationally hanged at Newgate. It was a big deal in the local area. He claimed in the time since this Jewish man, Israel Lipski, had been hanged, anyway, so he said the guy had shouted Lipski at him, and then the guy had chased him and he ran as far as Ellen Street and the railway and got away. But then at a later point, talking to a newspaper, he then claimed that what actually happened was he'd walked down the street, that had happened, and the guy had actually walked out of the Nelson pub on the corner, had pulled a knife on him and threatened him. The Nelson pub was actually closed. It closed at midnight. It was closed at the time he claimed this attack had took place. He then claimed, there was a great quote, he said, "I fled incontinently to my new lodgings," which I thought was fantastic. But he was never actually called to the inquest. The police don't seem to have taken him very seriously. I think he was one of many people that kind of came forward with false or misleading information, possibly in hope of getting a backhander off the newspaper for his story. Yeah,
well, his account was discredited. Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean that's fine, because I'm reading that too. I'm reading that his account certainly to the newspaper afterwards could easily have been embellished, because you're dealing with interpreters. You're dealing with a man who didn't really want any of this. He wanted to get away from all the trouble that he appeared to see developing. So yeah,
Schwartz hadn't taken into account as well. At the time when he came forward to give that statement, he was unaware that there were actually a number of other witnesses in the area at the time who had seen various different things. So there was a man called James Brown had actually seen Elizabeth Stride apparently talking to a man within 50 yards, if not 30 yards of the murder spot at that time. If you heard the quote where she'd apparently told the man, "No, not tonight, maybe some other night," and he'd walked on. Yeah. There was another man who I'd have to think of his name. He'd been inside the Working Men's Club in Dutfield's Yard, the International Jewish Working Men's Society. He said he'd been oppressed by the smoke in the room and to come out for a breath of fresh air. There was a lady called Frances Mortimer, lived at number 36, only a couple of doors up, and all of these people were later called to the inquest and had seen various bits and missed other various bits, but all of these people, without fail, missed Israel-Schwartz and this attack he apparently saw take place, and this guy with the knife and everything, but they didn't come forward till afterwards. He couldn't have known about that at the time.
There were a lot of witnesses, weren't they, around the murder of Elizabeth Stride, and a lot of activity, a lot of witnesses busy period, slightly different in terms of he wasn't able to perform any mutilations on her. Do you think that was the same man that killed Catherine-Eddowes?
Yes. Sometimes people say, for example, oh, well, you see, she wasn't mutilated like so many of the other victims were. But when they actually got to the crime scene there, some people will claim that Louis Deemschutz, with his pony and cart, must have pulled in there as he was doing the murder in the dark, and he hid behind the gate or something like that, and then when he went to get help, off he went running and didn't have time to do the mutilations. But the first doctor on the scene was actually a Dr. Blackwell, who lived at the end of the block. So the crime was discovered. It was a PC. Henry Lamb was the first one on the scene. He'd put the call out for Dr. Phillips, but in the meantime, Blackwell lived at the end of the street. So they'd sent someone up to get him. Blackwell turned up in the yard, he said, 1:15, and on examining the body, being the first medical professional to do it, he said, at 1:15, doing that examination, it was his opinion that the murder had taken place at some point between 20 and 30 minutes before he got there. So he claimed that while the body was discovered at, say, 1:01, the crime had actually taken place between 1:15 and 5:02, and she might have lain there for 10, 15 minutes or more. Also, when she was found, even though she wasn't mutilated, she was found on her back with her head to the side, eyes wide open, hand across the chest, objects arranged around her. He'd taken her hat from her head and placed it on the ground behind her, smeared the blood from a throat injury across her hand and her forearm. Nowadays, they will call these signature characteristics at the crime scene. They go above and beyond what's necessary. He's acting out his fantasy at the crime scene. So they would say today it's not entirely unheard of that you could have two murderers in the same area at the same time. That has happened, but it's very rare. But they would say it is unheard of that you would have two murderers anywhere that are both leaving these exact same signature characteristics. He's acting out a very complicated fantasy he's taken a long time to get to. So even though she wasn't mutilated, in a modern case, they would say these signature characteristics would say that it absolutely would indeed appear to be the same man.
Thanks.
I thought rather than actually get disturbed, even by his standards, it was an outrageously dangerous place to do the murder. At the side of the working men's club, by the door, as he's doing the murder, him and Elizabeth Stride would have heard guys on the other side of the door playing piano and drinking beers and singing songs. Dr. Blackwell said he think the whole offence had taken place, it had taken less than a minute to do it. I think he hadn't intended to do it there. It was the only offence at that point that was actually south of Commercial Road. It's out of his usual area. I think he'd done the deed quick as he could, being unhappy and uncomfortable with the crime scene, taken off running, and then he's ended up at Mitre Square somewhere 40, 50 minutes later.
That's good. That does make sense. The other witness who, when you talked about Mary Kelly and what happened to her, the other witness I was curious to read about was Hutchinson, who, from my recollection, he claims to have seen, and he gives quite detailed description of a man who went off with Mary Kelly, and he knows Mary Kelly by name. So, and then he describes in some detail this man who was with her, walking off with her on the night or the early morning of the day that she was found dead at the property. And he then talks about being a little bit concerned for her or what was going off, and did his own surveillance on the two of them, saw them go towards Kelly's property, I think. But what struck me was he didn't actually come forward until he realises at the inquest, or the initial inquest for Mary Kelly, he realises that somebody's describing him paying particular attention or being in the area looking a bit suspect. So, you know, in today's thing, he would have got looked at quite seriously because he's claiming to have a lot of information about her last movements. He has a lot of detailed information about a man that he claims was with her. He's then hanging around because he cares about her. You know, he would have got a lot of. Well, he would have been arrested, wouldn't he? I would think. So, what's your view on Hutchinson.
Hutchinson, on the night that he did that, he said he had been to Romford during the day and he'd walked all the way back, about 12 miles. He'd walked all the way back at one go, like a half marathon in the middle of the night. He said he then arrived, it was, I want to say it was about 2 o'clock in the morning he'd arrived, by which point numerous witnesses had actually seen her going into a room drunk about an hour and a half before that. But yes, he said he'd been walking along Commercial Street, had passed the entrance to Thrall Street, where he'd seen Mary Kelly and this supposed man there, and the man had the top hat and the jewels and this bag with the American leather and all this super detailed description he gave. He said he then walked on as far as the end of Flower and Dean Street, at which point they then walked past him, and he said the man had something, he'd kept his hat down but tried not to look him in the face or something like that. They'd apparently gone off, and he'd come forward the next day and said, yeah, I saw her with this guy. But he was another guy like Israel-Schwartz who was never actually called to any inquest. I remember reading an article in, I want to say, the Star newspaper. So George-Hutchinson had given this fantastic description of who this supposed man was. And then supposedly in the newspaper he'd taken a lot of abuse afterwards, people laughing at him saying, yeah, this guy's lying or whatever. And it was in the Star newspaper, or one of those tabloids, that said, while we've been reading these reports of people laughing at Mr. Hutchinson and saying he's an idiot or whatever, here at the Star we've decided he's actually a genius, because what he's managed to do is through this incredible, because he'd been unemployed, and they said through this amazing statement he's given, he's managed to find a way to get paid 3 times his usual wage for walking around the street with the police helping them with their investigation. So he'd taken a backhander for his story off the newspapers. I think the police had paid him some money to compensate him for his time. He then claimed he'd seen the guy again on Petticoat Lane, apparently, where we're sitting right now. He'd been on the market and seen this man again, and this was another one where at the time the police hadn't taken him seriously. He wasn't called to an inquest or anything. I think he fits in the same category as Israel-Schwartz, or indeed Matthew Packer, who was another witness that had come forward after the murder of Elizabeth Stride, claiming that he'd seen the killer and sold him grapes, and he spoke with an American accent and this kind of thing. I think the newspapers wanted to run with this crazy story, but I think the police at the time thought he was one of the many people that I think he was talking nonsense personally.